Hey, my name's Mason, and what happened to me in the wild still feels like a nightmare I can't wake up from. Ever heard of a grizzly attack? Yeah, well, I lived through one, and I'll never be the same again. I don't even know how to explain it, how something can come out of nowhere and completely rip apart your sense of reality. I've replayed that day 1,000 times in my head, and every time I feel that same sickening chill run down my spine. It started off as the most normal of days. I wasn't new to hiking or camping. Hell, I grew up doing this stuff. My buddies and I had gone on countless wilderness adventures before, so when we planned this trip, none of us really thought twice about it. We were heading into the Montana backcountry, somewhere far from the usual tourist spots. It was supposed to be a real escape, just a few days disconnected from the world. We wanted to push ourselves a bit further than usual, get into the heart of nature where we wouldn't see another soul for miles. We joked about it, even saying we'd be so far off the map that if we screamed, no one would hear us. Now, that thought sends a shiver down my spine. We set off early in the morning, me, Jake, Brandon, and Tony. We were in high spirits, packed with enough food, gear, and a sense of adventure that made us feel invincible. It's funny how quickly that can change. The trail we chose wasn't an official one. Jake had found it online, and we all trusted him. He was the outdoorsy type, always researching new hikes and pushing us to go deeper into the wild. The path was narrow and overgrown, but the scenery made up for it: towering pines, rocky outcrops, and streams that glistened under the morning sun. I felt alive out there, free from the noise of everyday life. We hiked for hours, stopping occasionally to snap photos or joke around. I remember thinking how perfect everything felt. We hadn't seen any other hikers, no signs of human life at all, just us and the forest. It felt surreal, like we had this entire slice of wilderness to ourselves. I loved that feeling until I didn't. It wasn't until mid-afternoon when things started to shift. We were hiking along a ridge, the kind where one wrong step could send you tumbling down into a valley below. The trail had gotten tougher, steeper, and narrower, but none of us complained. We liked the challenge. But then, out of nowhere, the woods went quiet. I mean, dead silent. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees, just a suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. I could feel my heart rate pick up, but I didn't say anything. None of us did. We just kept walking, but there was this underlying tension, like we all knew something was wrong. Then we heard it. A sound I'll never forget. It started as a low, distant growl, so deep it made my chest vibrate. At first I thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. My brain scrambled to make sense of it, but before I could even process the noise, it grew louder, closer. There was no mistaking it. It was a bear, and it was near. I stopped dead in my tracks, and the others did the same. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, eyes wide, ears straining to pinpoint the source of the growl. But it was hard to tell. Sound bounces off the mountains in weird ways, and it felt like the bear was everywhere at once. "Is that?" Jake whispered, his voice trailing off. "Yeah," I muttered, my throat tight. "That's a bear." We all knew the stories. Grizzlies ruled these mountains, and while attacks were rare, they weren't unheard of. People had gone missing out here, their bodies never found. We had bear spray, but at that moment, it felt like a joke. I'd never felt so exposed, so small. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A massive, hulking figure emerged from the tree line behind us, its brown fur catching the light. My heart sank. It was a grizzly bear, and it was bigger than I ever could have imagined, probably 700, maybe even 800 pounds of pure muscle. It looked prehistoric, like something that had no business still existing in the world today. My stomach twisted in knots. It wasn't charging, but it was moving toward us with slow, deliberate steps, its eyes locked on us like we were prey. There was no mistaking its intent. This wasn't some curious animal wandering by. This bear was hunting. Panic set in. Everything I thought I knew about survival flew out the window. My body screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be a death sentence. The bear would catch me in seconds. I felt trapped, frozen in place, as the bear closed the distance. "Don't move," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. I could hear the fear in it. "Just stay still." I don't know why I listened, but I did. We all stood there, motionless, hoping the bear would lose interest. But it didn't. Instead, it stopped just a few yards away from us, sniffing the air, testing it. I could see every detail now: the dark, beady eyes, the long snout, the massive claws that dug into the earth as it shifted its weight. It was terrifyingly calm, like it knew we didn't stand a chance. Then it happened. With a roar that seemed to split the air in half, the grizzly charged. Everything inside me screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. I barely had time to register what was happening before it was on top of me. The bear moved so fast it was like a blur of teeth and fur. I felt its massive paw slam into my side, sending me flying. The force of the blow knocked the wind out of me, and I hit the ground hard, my vision going black for a second. Pain exploded through my body as its claws raked across my side. I screamed, or at least I tried to. The sound that came out of my mouth was more like a gurgle, a pathetic, broken noise that didn't match the terror I felt. The bear stood over me, its hot breath washing over my face. I could smell it, this wild, earthy scent mixed with something darker, something metallic. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to survive, but there was nothing I could do. I was completely at its mercy. It swiped at me again, its claws digging into my back, and I felt a searing pain rip through me. I thought I was going to die. Right there, in the middle of the wilderness, torn apart by a grizzly bear. I was going to die, and no one would ever find me. But then, out of nowhere, I heard Jake shouting. I could barely make out his voice over the roaring in my ears, but he was yelling, throwing rocks at the bear, trying to draw its attention. For a split second, the bear paused, its head snapping toward Jake. I don't know how he did it, but he somehow distracted the bear long enough for me to start crawling away. Every inch I moved felt like agony. My whole body was screaming in pain, but I had to get away. I couldn't die out here. Not like this. I could hear the bear growling again, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it came after me. I don't know how, but Jake managed to hold its attention just long enough. He was shouting, waving his arms, doing everything he could to keep the bear's focus on him. And somehow, miraculously, it worked. The bear gave one final snarl before turning and lumbering off into the trees, leaving me lying there, gasping for air. The silence that followed was deafening. I could barely process what had just happened. My body was a mess of blood and pain, and I was shaking uncontrollably. I remember looking up at the sky, trying to focus on something, anything to keep myself from slipping into shock. My friends were there, shouting my name, but their voices felt distant, like they were coming from the other side of a tunnel. They rushed to my side, their faces pale with fear. Jake was the first to reach me, his hands shaking as he pressed down on the wounds to stop the bleeding. I could see the panic in his eyes, but he tried to stay calm for my sake. "You're gonna be okay." "Man," he kept saying, over and over, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. But I didn't believe him. I felt like I was dying, and I didn't know if I had the strength to survive. Somehow, my friends managed to carry me down the trail, back to the trailhead where we had parked our car. The trip down was a blur of pain and fear. I don't remember much of it, just the overwhelming urge to stay awake, to keep breathing. The pain was unbearable, and I could feel the blood soaking through my clothes. By the time we reached the car, I was barely conscious. I remember Tony driving like a madman, speeding down the winding mountain roads, while Jake sat in the back with me, his hands still pressing against my wounds. I could hear him talking, telling me to hold on, that we were almost there. But his voice felt far away, like I was already slipping away from the world. We finally reached a small ranger station, and they called in a helicopter to airlift me to the nearest hospital. The last thing I remember was the sound of the helicopter blades whirring above me, and then everything went black. I woke up in the hospital days later, hooked up to machines with bandages covering most of my body. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. Most people don't survive grizzly attacks, especially not ones as brutal as mine.